James Naughtie is with us now at the Stanfords Travel Writers Festival to take us on the road as he talks to Julia Wheeler.
Hello and welcome to the Stanfords Travel Writers Festival. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being on this journey with us. And thank you, Jim Naughtie, for being here as well as our guest today with a book which I have to say feels like rather required reading just now.
Well, that's very kind of you. I mean, it is a subject that is on everyone's minds. I mean, it's the story, effectively, as you've heard, of a journey that began for me in 1970 and continues to this day, namely the exploration and the attempted discovery, although it's a lifetime's task, of America with all its twists and turns, its characters, its glories, and its manifest weaknesses and periods of angst. I suppose you could say that we've just been through one of those over the last 4 years. I think that's an uncontroversial statement.
You talk about the tension between America being sort of full of precious self-confidence, but also trembling.
Well, that's true. The first thing I think that you have to understand about this country is anyone who knows it for 10 minutes will know, and I discovered it on my first visit there for a summer as a student in 1970, is that there is no country on earth, at least none more than 10 years old, that thinks about itself so much, that thinks about itself in the sense of its institutions, its birth pangs 230 years ago, its purposes and the aims of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness laid out in the Declaration of Independence. America is, and I don't use the word pejoratively, obsessed with itself, much more than, for example, any country I can think of in Western Europe. And what that means is that Americans are always asking themselves, who are we? What are we? What are we meant to be? What is the legacy? What is the American dream? And people spend lifetimes trying to argue that one through. And I think it means that when the democratic institutions are tested, as they've been recently, and there is an argument about how strong the democracy is, it's a real argument. It's not an academic thing that's just discussed in the halls of the great universities. It's an argument in the street. It's an argument around the kitchen table. And what that means, of course, is that when there is a moment of tension or a time of great division, which there is at the moment and has been for a few years, far before Trump came along, then the question of the strength of American democracy is absolutely front and center in the public debate. And it seems to me that what's happened over the last few months, and indeed over the last 4 years, isn't something that most Americans have felt shows the strength of their democracy. I think to many of them, perhaps a majority, it reminds them that any democracy, including their own, despite everything they say about it, is fragile. And I think they've realized how fragile it is. As you know, Julia, this book takes us from the Vietnam era, when I went there as a very young man in the midst of the Vietnam War, which divided the country, left 65,000 Americans dead, countless thousands, of course, in Southeast Asia, and divided families, communities, divided the country. And it is, I think, an unquestioned fact that America today is as divided, perhaps even more divided, than it has been since that time. So in that sense, this book has a beginning and an end that seem very familiar.
Yes, they're perfect bookends to each other, Nixon and Trump. Let's come back to current days in a while, but I want to take you back to 1970, and I wonder whether you might paint a picture of yourself as a character, really, going into America. What were you there for? Who did you meet? What did you do?
Well, I was there on a program which I think some people watching will know, the British University's North America Club, BUNAC, no longer sadly with us, which used to have a scheme whereby you could get a visa and a job for the summer, very ill paid, a B1 visa it was, a very spectacular thing. And we paid a meager sum, 35 quid or something, for a charter flight to and from. We had our visa and we had a job waiting for us. And then the usual pattern was you worked for 2 or 3 months. And then we used to go around the country on a Greyhound bus, because it took you everywhere. And we had the wonderful opportunity of traveling anywhere, night and day, for a month for $99, which in those days, with the exchange rate, was just over 40 quid for a month. Now, we thought this was a bit of a swizz because the previous year, they had come to the end of the period where it was $99 for 99 days. Can you imagine? 3 months travel around America for $99. I assume Greyhound stopped it when they realized what was going on. The thing was full of British students. Anyway, so I did this, and I worked for 2.5 months in upstate New York and then traveled the country and saw it for the first time. I'd never set foot on the continent before. Unfortunately, the job I got, well, it was unfortunate on the first day because I turned up at a kosher hotel in the Catskill Mountains, the Borscht Belt, a happy playground for many New Yorkers and summers for generations, and was made an assistant salad chef, age 17. Now, I didn't know anything about kosher food. There's not much of it around in Aberdeenshire. I could slice a lemon, but that was about it. I was totally unsuited to this. I was being paid less than the New York minimum wage. I was working sort of 12 hours a day. And for the first week, it was a complete nightmare working under a New York Chinese chef whose language I just couldn't understand, except the odd curse. And he couldn't understand a word I said. So it was a very difficult sort of arrival sort of process. But then I came to love it. And there was a bunch of us there, a bunch of British and Irish students. And 4 of us then got on a bus in August and went around the country. And I began to appreciate its vastness, its diversity, its sense of history, its sense of itself, and the sheer churning excitement of the place. I mean, there was darkness in the South, which was only 5 years after, well, the formal end of segregation, although in practice it was still there. The wild and ever-stretching West, New York with all its charms and, intoxicating atmosphere. So all these things hit me with such force that I sort of knew I'd be back, and I went back to study there 3 years later. And since then, I've been going and coming, on my own account, but also, fortunately, very fortunately, as a journalist.
And when you went back 1973, 74, of course, it was Watergate. And you say that you had a sort of, not exactly a ringside seat, but close enough. And I wonder whether...
Well, I was in the auditorium, put it like that. Yeah, it was an extraordinarily exciting time. I mean, I was a student in upstate New York, in Syracuse, Joe Biden's old university. So there you go. He was long gone by the time I got there, obviously. But... I knew I was going home to be a journalist. I'd got a job waiting for me. And a few of us got together a project where we arranged to go down to Washington and interview journalists about Watergate. And it was a complete scam, really. I mean, we're doing a research project, but come on. We all knew we were going to be journalists, and that's where we wanted to be. So I came to know Washington for the first time and met a lot of the main characters in the story. I mean, on the journalistic side, not the political side. And, I went to some of the impeachment hearings at the House Judiciary Committee of Nixon. And it was an extraordinary, I mean, for somebody about to go into the world of journalism, I mean, this was just nectar from the gods. I mean, you couldn't wish for a more melodramatic story. Little did I know that I would live to see an even more melodramatic presidential story, namely the one we've just been through. But at the time, it was so energizing and so intoxicating. I remember, my one regret was I had to leave to come home to get my new job on August the 8th, 1974, which was the day, actually it was August the 7th, the day after Nixon announced his resignation. He announced it the following day and actually resigned. And his resignation became effective on August the 9th, which was my 23rd birthday. So I was, it was quite a moment. It was a kind of red letter day. But that year was, it still swims in my memory. And I made friends in Washington who are still friends today. And when I went back a few years later on a fellowship at the Washington Post and worked there for a while, among those great figures that I'd interviewed during the Watergate era, including Ben Bradley, the legendary editor of the Post, who effectively brought down Nixon with Woodward and Bernstein, I discovered that these people were my colleagues, and Ben was my boss, and I knew him and loved him literally until he died in his 90s, not that long ago.
I wonder whether you see one of the parallels between Nixon and Trump as being that people still supported Nixon in the same way that they are Trump, despite the very obvious impropriety.
I think that is true. And that's an obvious parallel, that there were people who, for reasons we can all understand, of party loyalty, of a tribal sense of commitment to a man they'd supported through elections. Nixon, don't forget, was a very well-known figure. He'd been vice president for 8 years in the 50s under Eisenhower. He'd been an ever-present figure for anybody in middle age or beyond in American public life, for a quarter of a century. So, of course, there were people who had obligations to him, of loyalty, and they were shocked and shaken by the lifting of the curtain on just how sleazy it was. Now, I think that was a very fundamental moment for the Republic, if you like, because everybody who was around at that time had been brought up to believe that America was the shining city on the hill, as Reagan used to call it. It was the epitome of proper democracy and proper process and so on. And everyone knew that politicians got up to stuff. But when it was laid out, especially in the famous Nixon tapes, which were eventually published to his fury, and he lost a vote 9-0 in the Supreme Court to try to keep them private on the grounds of executive privilege, they were given a glimpse into a world that they really, I suppose, knew existed but didn't want to acknowledge. But, the point about Trump and Nixon is I think the parallels end there, because compared with what we know about Trump, let alone what we don't know, Watergate was a Sunday school picnic, and really was. I mean, I can remember Hugh Scott, the fuddy-duddy Republican from Pennsylvania, who was leader of the minority Republicans in the Senate at the time, standing on the front of the Senate Russell office building, doing an interview of television after the tapes came out, and holding a copy of the tapes and looking into the camera almost in tears, saying he'd never thought he would live to see the day when a president said "goddamn" in the Oval Office. Now, I mean, as I say in the book, I mean, I'm glad for his sake that he's not alive to read Trump's tweets. So, I mean, I think we've traveled a long way, and it's not for me to say whether it's a downward path or an upward path, but I'll let others judge.
We're still obviously in the maelstrom and very much in the sort of the news side of things at the moment, rather than looking back and taking stock as we can with Nixon. But I wonder what you think about the future in terms of Gerald Ford pardoned Nixon. And part of the thinking, as I understand it, for that was that actually, if you have a convicted criminal as president, how does that make you look to the rest of the world? What does it say about democracy, et cetera, et cetera? Do you think that is still something that will be in the minds of Joe Biden and his party now?
Well, I think it's a fascinating question. Ford had been made vice president, chosen by Nixon, after Spiro Agnew, his old bruiser of a vice president, had resigned, having admitted corruption when he was governor of Maryland, and he was continuing to receive brown envelopes stuffed with money from building contractors while he was vice president in the White House. And Ford was there. They used to say that Ford had been chosen because no one would impeach Nixon if Ford was going to be president, because he was regarded as a slightly slow, not very bright member of Congress. Lyndon Johnson famously said that he couldn't walk and chew gum at the same time, although he didn't actually say walk. It was slightly different, but we won't go into that here because it's a decent audience who wouldn't appreciate profanity, I'm sure. Anyway, but Ford took office in the trauma of the Nixon resignation, which was a really traumatic moment for the country. And he said it's a time of healing. And he believed that the only way to draw a veil over that period and lay it to rest was to pardon Nixon. Now, it was very controversial, but a friend of mine was a historian and a constitutional scholar, also incidentally LBJ's nephew, so he knows politics inside out, told me a story of a dinner where Ford was asked, as he was asked 3 times a day for the rest of his life, why did you pardon Nixon? Because it almost certainly cost him the election against Jimmy Carter in 1976. And Ford said he didn't regret it because A, it was the right thing to do. And B, he added, but I was beaten by a good man. In other words, he was willing, despite their political differences, to acknowledge that Carter was a decent man committed to the same ideals of democracy as he was. Now, what's interesting about that is that I think the political atmosphere has become so poisoned, it's so toxic, partisanship has taken over to such an extent in the last 20, 25 years that you simply can't imagine. Trump is the exemplar of that. He didn't invent it. He inherited it. He's the symptom, not the cause. You couldn't imagine that kind of reflection being made now. And I think that Biden will be very conscious of how he does what the country wants, and at the same time doesn't appear to be underplaying what happened. I mean, if Trump finds himself in legal difficulty, and were he to be convicted of anything, or were he to be charged with serious offences, I think of, whatever kind, whether they're financial, whether they're about the abuse of power, anything you can imagine. And I don't think that's beyond the realms of possibility. Let me leave it at that. I think it would be quite difficult for Biden because there is a pressure coming at him from both ends. One, that he says, as he said at the very moment of his election, and he's been repeating ever since, it's a time for healing. It's a time for less anger, less division. That's going to be his calling card in the first phase of his presidency. And so there's a strong argument for him to say, look, let's draw a line under all this. At the same time, the anger about the Trump era is so deep that I think if there were legal questions that were serious, and not just, arguments that could go one way or another, I think it would be extremely difficult for Biden to go down that route. And I think, frankly, although Trump supporters would regard it as a betrayal of huge proportions, I suspect that a pardon would be devastating for Biden. And I think it's extremely unlikely. I mean, we're talking about circumstances that might never arise. And if they do arise, we don't know in what way. But I think that would be very difficult for Biden. And I think talking about those two things, Ford and Trump, Ford versus Nixon and Trump and Biden, it exhibits one of the things which I think is a theme of this book, of how politics has changed and the practice of politics has changed in a couple of generations in the States. I mean, the Senate that Joe Biden entered in 1972 as a 29-year-old, he only was able to take his seat in the first week of January in 73 because he had his 30th birthday in the November that he was elected in, because you have to be 30 to take your seat. So he was the youngest senator. And he spent the next 34 years in the Senate before he became vice president under Obama for 8 years. And the Senate that Biden knew was one that was above all collegiate. There were huge ideological disputes. Of course, they disagreed on both sides of the aisle about tax, about various aspects of civil rights reform, all the rest of it. But there were deals to be done. And that is the way that Biden has operated. He sees the Senate as a deliberative body, as somewhere where in the end, people come together and they reach an accommodation. That's his political métier. Much more difficult to do that now, even if you're sitting in the White House. But his whole attitude is that it is a time to calm things down. One of his people said to me, look, it may be time for a boring presidency. People have had so much anger, so much division, so much excitement, to use a neutral word, that they may want a bit of a break. The question of a pardon, I think, could disturb that really, really seriously. And I suspect that it would be very, very hard. I mean, if you look at what happened when the Capitol was invaded, with Trump egging people on, and Rudy Giuliani, his lawyer, saying this is trial by combat, I think that language means that it's going to be very, very difficult for Trump to claim forgiveness if it ever comes to that.
You mentioned Jimmy Carter, and I wonder whether he's an example of something that does keep coming back within American politics, namely that the president as an outsider, as Clinton was, and arguably as Trump was in a different way.
That's right. I mean, it's no accident that the only two presidents, let's leave Biden out for a moment, the only two presidents over 50 years from the end of World War II, from 1945 until the end of the Obama years, only two presidents had been elected directly from the Senate, or indeed from the House, Kennedy and Obama. Both, well, Kennedy was a two-term senator, Obama was a one-term senator. And constantly you get the idea that someone rides in on a white horse from outside Washington. It was true of Eisenhower, who led the Allied forces in the Second World War, elected in 1952. LBJ was an exception, but of course he'd been vice president under Kennedy, so he automatically succeeded, but he was a Senate man to his bootstraps. Nixon had been vice president, but had been out through the 60s, came back in. Jimmy Carter, governor of Georgia. Ronald Reagan, governor of California. George H.W. Bush, again, a slight exception because he'd been Reagan's vice president for 8 years, so he just inherited. Clinton, governor of of Arkansas. George W. Bush, governor of Texas. Now, in a sense, Biden is the most old-fashioned of presidents. I mean, on paper, Biden has got the best CV you could have. I mean, 34 years in the Senate, 8 years as vice president. Nobody can touch that. But he is unusual in the sense that he is Washington established man. Now, one of the great themes of America, going right back to the beginning and the founding fathers, has been an ingrained suspicion of centralized government. And it flows right back from the story of the Revolutionary Wars, the story of the Constitutional Convention that produced the Constitution, the Declaration of Rights. These are embedded in the education system in America, in folklore. And what it means is there is always a suspicion of big government. It's nothing new. I mean, it takes different forms. It's taken a different form in the Trump era, a much more vigorous and, toxic form, really. But it's always been there. And so Carter was the outsider who rode in from Georgia after the Watergate period. We've had enough of Washington and its ways. The rhetoric of the Carter campaign in 1976 was exactly what you get today. Washington knows best. We don't want that. What about you? You're sitting in Peoria, Illinois, or in Austin, Texas, and you don't know what these guys are up to. You send them to Washington and they get off. It's an absolutely consistent theme that takes different forms with different personalities, but it's there. That's what Carter was like and what Reagan was like. And you see, Reagan is a very interesting figure. I think abroad, the most underestimated American president, not because he was of the modern era, not because he was brilliant or deft or anything else, but his effect on the country was profound, much more profound, I think, than people quite often on this side of the Atlantic realize. I mean, in two ways. One, that he did what he said he would do. He gave them back a sense of America. His famous slogan in his 1984 re-election campaign was, "It's morning in America again." The sun is coming up and it's casting light on these wonderful hills and valleys and right from east to west, from sea to shining sea, as the great patriotic song has it. And Reagan did that. And at the same time, of course, what he did was he sowed the seeds for a powerful and extraordinarily fundamental conservative revolution, which really led to the politics of today. So there were two aspects to Reagan. But again, he was the outsider who came in and said, look, it's time to do things differently. And of course, what Biden is thinking, a very different figure from Reagan. I mean, completely different in all kinds of ways, by background, by political sentiment, by temperament, by emotional character, but nonetheless trying to do something that Reagan managed to do. And I know Biden is well aware of this. What he wants to do is to say, look, where is the America we used to know? Where is the America where you sat on the back porch and your neighbors came in and sat there and, had a drink with you or a cup of tea, and they didn't scream and shout because you voted the other way in the election? Where is the civility in the public discourse that we used to have? Now, some would say that's nostalgia for an America that never was. Up to a point, that's true, but it's not entirely true. Reagan looked like somebody who'd stepped off the rocking chair in a Norman Rockwell painting of a porch in a lovely house in the prairie. And that is the image that he very carefully calculated. And because of his actorial skills, he was able to put it across. And Biden's challenge, in a way, is to recalibrate that for a different age, a different generation. You know, younger Americans don't remember Reagan. It's like, you know, anybody, even in their 30s, has difficulty remembering Margaret Thatcher. And I think that's Biden's lodestar is Reagan, not because he agrees politically with him. And Reagan was a deregulator, a fundamental conservative who believed that the only thing worth fighting for was a smaller government. Biden doesn't believe that. But he does know what Reagan managed to, the trick he pulled, I don't use that pejoratively, but the trick he managed in the White House to persuade Americans that things were better, even when they weren't, actually. And that's what he's got to do too.
And he did it with a very simplistic message, didn't he, for Americans? I wonder whether you would agree with the line of thought that says that Reagan sort of outperformed at home, or was better regarded at home compared to abroad, whereas George, the other way around, he had, you know, the reputation was there, but he was unable to convince Americans at home that he should have that second term.
Well, I think, you know, I think it's true that Reagan had a very, very different character at home compared with his character abroad. He had, of course, an enormous stroke of luck. I mean, really, you know, one of these things that comes along once in a generation in the form of Mikhail Gorbachev, because Gorby arrived as, you know, as Mrs. Thatcher famously said, the man you could do business with. And Reagan was able to capitalize on this and get into a backslapping relationship, for goodness sake, with the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Reagan, who'd been a red baiter all his life, found himself in the happy position. And one of the reasons he did, by the way, is that MI6 had this extraordinary figure inside the Russian apparatus, Oleg Gordievsky, who escaped from the Soviet Union in 1985 because he'd been rumbled, but was, you know, possibly one of, well, as far as we know, one of the most significant Western agents inside the Soviet system that we ever had during the Cold War. And all his stuff, which was coming back to London, and he had a period in the Soviet embassy in London for, you know, 6 or 8 years leading up to the 80s, went, of course, straight to the White House. They didn't know who he was. In fact, they eventually found out, and that's one of the reasons he was rumbled, because there was a leak from the CIA, which embarrassed the Americans no end. Anyway, the point about Gordievsky was that he was able to tell Thatcher and Reagan from his observations exactly what was going on in the Kremlin, and the idea that Gorby, if they gave him some help, would be a reforming figure who would effectively, although he would never say it and still doesn't admit it, bring the curtain down in the Soviet Union. And so it proved. And of course, Reagan was exactly the right guy to do this. He had his moments of great drama. Mr. Gorbachev tear down that wall, he said, at the Brandenburg Gate in 1987. But behind the scenes, he and Thatcher were able to make common cause with Gorbachev. And I think, to the surprise of both of them, it came quicker than they expected. Just after Reagan had left office in 1989, when the wall came down. And of course, Mrs. Thatcher had a very difficult collision of views in her own head about this, because of course she wanted the end of the wall and the unification of Europe. But the last thing she wanted was a unified Germany. And she was deeply troubled by that, which of course was a direct consequence of the end of the Cold War. But that is a story for another day. But Reagan had that ability to be able to say, I am the president who brought the Cold War to an end. And that was no mean boast. I mean, whatever the ups and downs of the story, and there were many, he could leave office and say, I did that. And I think a lot of Americans would revere him for that. And despite all the political divisions and arguments in his time, and he was in many ways a very controversial figure on the liberal side of politics. But by the time he died, of course, he developed Alzheimer's quite early after he left office in the early 90s. By the time he died in California, unaware of what was going on, I think, he had a status in America that was rather like the Queen Mother. I mean, it sounds odd, but he was a revered national figure. It was almost like a monument at Mount Rushmore.
I wonder what the view from Moscow is right now. Vladimir Putin sitting there in the Kremlin. What must he be thinking, hoping, expecting?
Well, it's bad news for him. There's absolutely no question that the Russians enjoyed the Trump era. I spoke to somebody the other day deeply involved in foreign policy for a long time, actually a Republican senator who became defense secretary for 3 years under Obama, Chuck Hagel, who said to me that there was absolutely no question, and this is not just the view of the foreign policy establishment in Washington and London and Berlin and Paris, but anybody who studies the thing, Trump's policies were an enormous opportunity for Putin in the Middle East, in Crimea, in Ukraine, where Trump refused to challenge him. Trump was undermining NATO, saying pretty well it was a waste of time. He didn't understand NATO. He didn't understand why America put money into it to defend Germany. What's that all about? The Cold War's over. Well, because the Germans were horrified by this. All the European capitals were horrified. But from Putin's point of view, the destabilization of NATO, the destabilization of Europe through Brexit, the opening in the Middle East to make the Soviet Union a big player in the Middle East for the first time, and an American president whose foreign policy was, to put it politely, and this is a view on the American right, this is not a view from the left, was to say, well, at the least you could say it was a seesaw foreign policy. It had no coherence. John Bolton, who was, the neocon's neocon, when he wrote his memoir, having spent a short time, very unhappy time as Trump's national security advisor, wrote a book from the conservative right, absolutely excoriating Trump and all his works, pouring scorn on him, making fun of him, saying he didn't understand the world, his ignorance was profound. That is a view widely shared by people who've worked in the Trump administration, by some of his former secretaries of state, by former defense secretary Jim Mattis. And they all say, whatever their political view privately, in a party sense, that Trump provided a space into which Putin could step happily. That space will now be closed off.
You talked about Reagan having, bringing to an end the Cold War, which was his big thing, certainly the biggest legacy. I wonder what you think Clinton's legacy is. I mean, there was the famous handshake. We talk about the Middle East. Is that something that still resonates today, or would you choose something else?
I think it's a very interesting question, this, because Clinton's presidency in 92 to 2000 was overshadowed, I think, in the public mind, certainly, by what we call in shorthand the Lewinsky affair. I mean, his affair with an intern, the fact that he lied about it, there's no question about that. The impeachment that followed, although he was never convicted in the Senate. He was impeached by the House, not convicted in the Senate. And that tends to color the whole Clinton era. And it's one of the reasons that he, and of course Hillary, who was first secretary and then went on to fight in 2016, became a demonic couple on the right of politics in America. And I think that Clinton suffered hugely from that personal lapse, or those aspects of his personal life that became public. And I think it's colored the way that he's seen. But, Clinton, apart from anything else, is one of the cleverest men to occupy the White House in the modern era, beyond any argument. He was an extremely clever guy. And he had a very difficult hand to play after the Republicans won the House of Representatives in the 94 midterm elections. So it was very difficult to get things through. He tried health reform, very much along the Obama lines. It didn't work. He couldn't get it through. And so a lot of his reforms were not successful. Economically, he left office with a pretty good record. And I think that he can say that he set the course for quite a lot of reforms that liberals would be happy with. They were unhappy with the way that he often trimmed to the right to try to get a deal. But I think the Clinton years will probably be rescued historically. In foreign policy, I think he had several big achievements. I mean, he was a great friend to Europe. He was faced, of course, with the disintegration of the Soviet Union and the terrible consequences of kind of the lid coming off and the wild west of money in Russia. But I think that people in Europe who dealt with the Clinton administration would believe that in defense and foreign policy, he was a secure figure. But as I say, Clinton will never, ever escape the shadow of his personal life. It's haunted him. And as we saw with Hillary in 2016, she found that the passions stirred up by that whole episode in the 90s hadn't dissipated at all. And fundamentally, I think that probably made the difference between her winning and losing, although, of course, she won the popular vote by 3 million.
I've often wondered whether that was her standing was the equivalent of Cherie Blair standing, and sort of, I mean, obviously very different, backgrounds and lives and whatever, but actually, if the Labour Party had put up Cherie Blair, how many Labour supporters would have been able, and the rest of the country, able to support that, given Blair's record?
It's a very difficult comparison, I think, because the position of a prime ministerial spouse in this country is so different. I mean, they can be quite famous or not famous. Dennis Thatcher was very well known for all kinds of reasons, but was seen, and I say this, I think affectionately, not critically, was seen as a slightly comic figure. I mean, he really was, the private eye letters and so on. Theresa May's husband, Philip, I almost forgot, was, apparently a very powerful figure behind the scenes and advising her, but, unknown to the public. Cherie Blair certainly was better known. Gordon Brown was famously private about his life and his family. I just think that Norma Major never wanted to come to London, let alone be a public figure. I just think it's completely different. I mean, a first lady, and of course, there's never been anything else in the United States. There's been never a first husband. I don't know what that person would be called. We may find out before too long. I think that it's a completely different culture. And of course, running for president is completely different from being the leader of a party which gets a majority in parliament. So I think you can't really compare them. The thing about Clinton Hillary, as opposed to Clinton Bill, is, of course, that she'd been a political figure really all her life. When she was a young lawyer, I did a long interview with her for the book, actually, which makes up most of a chapter, because she's a fascinating figure. And this was after the 2016 defeat, went to see her in New York. She went as a young lawyer, which you could have walked into any of the big law firms in New York. She went instead as a civil rights lawyer to the South in the days when desegregation was working its way through, and got deeply involved in the aftermath of the 60s civil rights movement. And then she was, a deeply political figure from then on. And when she was in the White House, Clinton put her in charge, for example, of the efforts to get healthcare reform. So she wasn't coming in as some kind of bimbo who'd just been walking around with a handbag accompanying her husband. I mean, she was a really powerful figure. And so it wasn't surprising. But Laura Bush was equally powerful in terms of her political views, would have no interest in George W. Bush, his wife, would have no interest in becoming a candidate. But Hillary Clinton, because she was ambitious, did. But it's completely un-British. I mean, in fact, if you want to look at one of the ways in which the American system, the presidential system, where you have the president and then the co-equal branch in Capitol Hill, is different from our own, that is a very good lens through which to see it. I think comparing first ladies who might run for office. I've got no doubt that Trump in his dreams would think of one of his children eventually running for office, Ivanka or Donald Jr. or Eric. I think Eric, extremely unlikely. But, he knows perfectly well, although he pours scorn on the dynasties of American politics, the Kennedys, the Bushes, who saw themselves as a dynasty, incidentally. I mean, father president, son president, George W.'s brother, governor of Florida, a family with, and all the offspring of the family, and all involved in politics in some way. And Trump says these dreadful dynasties. But, of course, there's one thing he would love more than anything else, which is the name of Trump to persist in American politics. I think it's a fairly safe bet that it won't.
Fun to speculate about all of these things, and as you say, to use them as a prism to draw out the similarities and the differences. Your book, Jim, is many things. I mean, it's journalism, it's part memoir, it's all lively and entertaining, and it's you are such a wonderful raconteur, both on the page and as we've seen today in real life. I mean, there is one section that jumped out at me, given that we are at a Travel Writers Festival, that particularly jumped out at me in terms of travel writing, and that was your train journey. And I wonder if you might say something about how that differs.
Well, I'm really glad you liked that section. We've been talking a lot about politics, and there is a thread of politics through this book, because as a journalist and an observer, I've inevitably been there for big moments, big events, and I've enjoyed the sheer vivacity of the political system there, and the characters I've seen and the events I've been at. So that's a big thread in the book, but it's also an exploration of the country and its character and its people and the diversity, which of course is the first thing that strikes you. And one of the things I did, which I love American trains, creaky old things really, because the system collapsed in the 50s and they rebuilt it to some extent. But the cross-country trains, which, you know, very few people use, because unless you're scared of flying, because why would you take a train from New York to Los Angeles when you can fly in 4 hours? However, one journey I'd always wanted to make was a journey on the city of New Orleans, the train, and the famous song that Arlo Guthrie and Willie Nelson and others recorded, a Steve Goodman song, Nighttime on the City of New Orleans. You probably know it. And I got on the train one winter's night in Chicago, a city I love. And I always say to people, if they're going to America for the first time, they say, where can we go? We've got a travel plan. I always say, if you don't see Chicago, you're missing America. I mean, it is in many ways the great American city. It's got the best of New York, but it's got the best of an out of New York feel. And it takes you back to the heyday of the American city, which of course is one of the extraordinary cultural phenomena of the 20th century. Anyway, I got on the train one very, very cold night, and Chicago gets appallingly cold. I remember our son, Andrew, spent a couple of years at the University of Chicago as a graduate student, and he sent me an email one night. This is about 10 years ago. Sent me an email one night. He was living in a student dorm, and they had received a message saying, do not leave the dorm. There is a risk of death. And it was sort of minus 30 or something outside. I mean, Chicago is just, you know, very cold. Anyway, I got the train, which takes about a day and a half to get to New Orleans, where, of course, they've never seen snow in their lives. And it's sultry, and it's the Gulf, and it's the bayou, and it's a completely different subtropical place. And the only thing Chicago and New Orleans have got in common is organized crime on a vast scale, and an amazing history of kind of political corruption in both cities. Anyway, I got on this train, and really the purpose was simply to spend time on it, enjoy the journey through the night. I love sleepers anyway, because I grew up in the north of Scotland, and, you know, I've loved the sleeper all my life. And meet people on the train and talk to them, different people. And of course, it's a wonderful trip, because you go down through southern Illinois and you touch Kentucky, and then you start to head towards Mississippi itself, and you go down the river, you go down the Mississippi for the last 2/3 of the journey. The Mississippi, which I think is really the bloodstream of America, you know, where Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer cavorted. It's deep in the American spirit. And then you end up in New Orleans, the city of Hurricane Katrina, of course, as people came to know it in 2004, where it was, you know, destroyed by floods. But it still has this alluring, jazz-driven spirit, which is quite different from anywhere else in America. I mean, it's like a different planet circling out there. But I talked to people and then went back on the train. So I just spent a week and went down, went back, did nothing except sat there with a recorder and a notebook and read and wrote and read. One of my favorite American authors is James Lee Burke, who writes about New Orleans with such fantastic insight and passion. Anybody who has not read James Lee Burke, his New Orleans novels, please do. And I'll regard this as worthwhile simply on that basis. Anyway, and I went back up through Memphis, as you do. And I got off at Memphis because I'd never been to Graceland, the Elvis Presley shrine. I don't know why I'd never been, but anyway, I hadn't. And I went. And of course, that was wonderful. And the jazz you can still hear on Beale Street in Memphis into the early hours of the morning. So it was a journey really that took me into the heart of America. And I've always had a feeling, as I say, I think right at the beginning of the book, that America's a place for journeys. It really is. I mean, if you go and just land in New York and spend 5 days there, you have a great time. You go to a great jazz bar, or you walk through Central Park, only during the day, incidentally. And you'll see things that you've never seen before. And it is the city that never sleeps, except at the moment, where it is in a long, painful slumber thanks to COVID. But the thing about America is you've got to travel. You've got to go to New England. You've got to go to the South. You've got to see the coast. You've got to see the Rockies. You've got to see the plains. Now, this takes a long time. But unless you do that, unless you absorb the different impulses and the feelings, the different language, the different culture, different way people speak. I mean, the first time you go to the West and you see people wearing beautifully embroidered snakeskin cowboy boots and wearing vast Stetson hats, as they walk down the street in Texas, you think you've walked onto a Hollywood set, but it's perfectly natural. And when you go to New England and you find people who still choose select men to run these little townships in an 18th century style, where they can recite for you the names of the revolutionary battles from the 1770s around Massachusetts and over in New Hampshire and Vermont, you realize how close this history is. And then when you go to the South, you realize how close the Civil War is. And you realize how that is something they can still touch the moment the country was divided. 1 in 50 Americans was killed in the Civil War in the 1860s. And it was only thanks to, I think, probably by common consent, the greatest of all presidents, the first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, that this was brought to an end, and healing came, talking about healing earlier on in his great second inaugural in 1864, when he said, "With malice toward none, let's heal the wounds of a nation." And so all these different parts of the country have a different story to tell. And until you understand the diversity and the color of the mosaic that makes it up, I don't think you even begin to comprehend not only the excitement of the place because of its vastness, but the difficulty that it presents in organizing a country, let alone leading it and governing it. I mean, it is a very, very difficult thing. New York to Los Angeles is not far short of New York to London. And the distance that we would, from here to Istanbul is one that Americans would regard as, perfectly manageable. And they would do it, once a week to go to work quite happily.
Jim, thank you so much for taking us there today. When you were describing those different parts of America, then I had goosebumps just thinking, I want to go.
I think in updating the paperback, which is formally published, although I think it's now available in February, I took the story through the Trump election, basically up to New Year. And of course, in that sense, the revised paperback brings us up to date through politics, but it's also about the culture that we've been talking about. It's about the impulses that shape this vast, diverse country. And it's about those questions that come back insistently. My favorite last line in any book is that in The Great Gatsby, when the narrator, Nick Carraway, was about to leave New York with all its empty glories back to the Midwest, says, "So we beat on, boats against the current, drawn back ceaselessly into the past." And that's true of America. They come back to those fundamental questions that I think are the core of this book. Who are we? What are we? And what should we be? Those are the questions that have defined America throughout its time on this earth and define it still today.
A wonderful place to end it, with a little bit of Gatsby and some Fitzgerald. Thank you so much, Jim. As I say, it's a wonderful book, required reading right now. So do please go to the Stanfords website, buy it. Jim, thank you so much for your time today. Thanks so much, as I say, for taking us there. It's been really wonderful to be in your company.
Well, thank you, Julia. I've enjoyed the conversation hugely, and thanks to everyone who's tuned in by whatever means. I do hope you enjoy it.
Fascinating and timely stuff, with a lovely squeeze of literature in there too. America's politics can feel like epic theatre, so hearing from an expert on some of the plot points and protagonists has been a real treat. Special thanks then to James Naughtie and Julia Wheeler. If you too have a wistful yearning to understand more of the vastness of America, then On the Road, Adventures from Nixon to Trump is certainly on the reading list. And the newly updated copy available at stanfords.co.uk.